So to recap from a previous devblog video, The Open Waste is a 3D first-person open source tribute to Fallout that's made in the Godot engine. And to recap a previous devblog, the first milestone for the game was to create procedurally generated buildings, procedurally generated terrain, and an enemy that could kill the player and also be killed by the player. In a previous video, I mentioned that one of the first sub-goals when it came to dealing with the enemies was to have nav meshes in the game world. And nav meshes are used to navigate characters where a path from A to B, for example, where the character is and where the player is not immediately obvious. As far as I can tell, I've got 4 different options for making nav meshes in Godot. One of them is to bake them via the editor and its interface. Another one is to bake them at runtime from script, calling the option to bake nav meshes when the game runs. Another option is to make the geometry for nav meshes in Blender and to import from there into Godot and then simply call that a nav mesh. And the fourth option is to create nav meshes from code, vertex by vertex, and then to call that a nav mesh. So for the inside of the buildings, for the floors and the staircases, I went with the Blender option. For the open world outside the buildings, I attempted generation at runtime because the terrain is procedurally generated and by definition will be different each time the game runs. However, the nav meshes created in Blender and the nav meshes created at runtime on the open world clashed quite badly. I simply couldn't get the edges of the two to meet in a nice way. This is where the Godot Discord community came to the rescue, and more specifically, the vocal chat area is a great place to exchange ideas with other game developers. I saved a huge amount of time because I learned that nav meshes aren't needed in open world areas, only around complex array of obstacles. So I simply scrapped that idea, and in the open world areas, there aren't any nav meshes, and the basic logic for making a character go from A to B is very simple. Therefore, it's okay just to have nav meshes in the buildings. And there it is going to be necessary because the buildings are multi-story with staircases between the floors. And they'll have more objects in them as time goes on. That allowed me to focus on the enemies themselves. This here is the Shotgun Monk character from Realm 667, which is a resource for modders of classic Doom. And as I was mulling over how to code the behavior for these enemies, YouTube recommended to me videos on finite state machines. Finite state machines are a great way to break down NPC behavioral states into modular blocks. So, for example, a block for aiming, a block for firing, a block for pursuing the player, and a block for strafing left to right. It took me 3 days at the end of June to finally crack what finite state machines were and how they work, but it was totally worth it. Something else I'm proud of is the projectiles that the enemy fires at the player and which the player can fire at enemies. I learned an awful lot about vectors, although I have to admit that ChatGPT helped a lot, particularly with some of the more complex mathematics involved in dealing with vectors. The player character now has an arm and a gun, both of which were taken from BlendSwap. All I needed to do was resize them a bit and position them relative to one another before importing them into Godot. So, to recap the recap, procedurally generated buildings. Alright, so what I've got is essentially a glorified stairwell with windows, but it works and has its own set of nav meshes. Procedurally generated terrain. What I have is too small and will need a successor with dynamic level of detail. At the moment, as the terrain gets larger, the number of vertices and thus the amount of geometry and thus the amount of work your computer has to do grows exponentially. So that will need to be succeeded at some point. But again, it works. It's genuinely procedurally generated and has a shader which distributes textures vertically, i.e. by altitude. An enemy that can be killed and can kill the player. Fair enough. The Doom-style billboard sprites are a tech that's very nearly, if not very actually, 30 years old. However, the Shotgun Monk has a fairly sophisticated shotgun projectile attack, which fires buckshot in the player's direction, a fairly sophisticated behaviour tree, thanks to the finite state machines. And to be honest, you're not going to see the fairly janky graphics of the sprite too close up because the shotgun's a spicy meatball that can take you out with 2 or even 1 shots. Because the first milestone is now passed, I've turned the game into a working demo, and you can find a link to that in the description, which is available for Windows, Mac and Linux. I'm going to start making noise about the open wastes elsewhere on the internet, so not just here on YouTube, but also on classic Fallout sites like No Mutants Allowed, so hi if you've come over from No Mutants Allowed, obviously Reddit and things like that. And I'm going to open a Discord channel dedicated solely to the open wastes, and a link to that you will also be able to find in the description. The next major goal for the project will be to vastly improve and extend the layout of the buildings, procedurally of course, and that will mean I will be able to have rooms that are not occupied by staircases and thus able to hold things like containers and other things to loot and other points of interest later on. By the end of the next goal, I will be assigning NPCs to buildings, which will mean I will need behavioural blocks in the finite state machine for each enemy for being on the nav mesh and off a nav mesh. But before that, I've decided to give myself a little milestone reward, and I'm going to add a minigun to the game, just for fun. So to wrap up the video, I want to give a shout out to Cake Monitor for proofreading the code, not just during the last update, but several times during the project so far. So thanks for that, man. And yeah, that's pretty much it. You know the drill by now. Like, subscribe, download the demo, more importantly, and get your ass to the Discord. And I'll see you in the next one.